So in the last episode we took care of all of the bodywork and paint the exterior, of course. That is set aside to cure for a couple of days, and in the meantime I could move on to finishing off all the interior. So first of all the parts were primed with some Tamiya Gray primer through the airbrush, and then I painted them, of course, in their own different colors. Some of you keen-eyed viewers might have already noticed that this is not the airbrush that I usually use. Normally I'm using a Hardware Stainback 2-in-1 Evolution. I've had that for years and years and have been using it with great pleasure. Now I did find that my hands aren't really all that small. The airbrush was a little bit small for my hands, and therefore it could cramp up really badly after a couple minutes of painting. I've wanted one of these trigger style airbrushes for a long time, specifically with the fan option for the nozzle as well, trying that on some clear coat later on, but I'm still getting used to it now with the normal nozzle. This is just a 0.5mm needle and tip, and it works perfectly fine for all of these smaller parts and airbrushing it. So I'm still testing it. I will be using it a lot more as it's a lot more comfortable in my hands, and if you're interested in one for yourself, I will try to find some links and put them down in the description. So the main interior itself is painted in orange, and that is the contrasting color for the stripes that I used on the exterior. I thought it would be a really nice touch, as I've seen that done on a lot of these Singer vehicles in the 1:1 scale, just giving it a little bit of continuity in the design. Now to break that up a little bit, I decided to paint the dashboard in black and also add a couple black details to the rest of the interior as well, and also tone some of the interior down with a bit of shading and weathering with some Tamiya Panelline accent color. During the unboxing of the kit, I showed all the various decal sheets that were included, and there were also some for the interior, giving a nice stitch pattern for the entire door panel and also on the center of the seats. There were some details in there like the speaker grills and other parts, but there are also a couple of photo etch pieces to go instead. Now since I used a orange paint for the interior, I couldn't use these decals as they wouldn't match up all that nicely. I did use a couple of decals for the dashboard as they were pretty much necessary, with a lot of the details being in those decals themselves. And for a small part like details on this dashboard, it is still nice to have it, but for the rest of the seats I figured it wouldn't really match up all that nice since it's not a darker brown interior. A couple of these photo etch pieces that were glued on have some really nice detail in them, but if I just leave them plain silver, it wouldn't really show up all that well. So I added a bit of Panelline accent color just to show the lower areas and highlight the top silver section, giving it a nice contrasting detailed look. After finishing up the interior, I could move on to the chassis and exterior side of things. For the exterior, I decided again to keep the continuity of the orange and go with some orange center sections for the wheels as well. The main chassis itself was painted flat black, and then I added some details for the transmission and part of the engine that was still visible with some silver paints, and then weathered them just a little bit with some Panelline accent color again. So on my previous build of the Ford Mustang GT500 that I did, I tried some of this Molotow Chrome through the airbrush on some of the exterior pieces. I was really happy with the result, but sadly I quickly ran out of paint, so I couldn't do it to all of the pieces. In this case, I ordered some new paint, of course, and tried it again. With this fresh batch, it's really easy to apply, and it looks really cool, better than all the chrome finishes I've tried before. It does take a little while to cure and dry up, but once it has been cured, I really like the convincing look. It's a bit scaled down and fits to the model really nicely. On the body itself, there were still a couple of photo etch pieces that needed to be glued in place, so I did that and could then paint them black. One of the nicer but also tougher things about this build are the clear parts. They are pre-cut and pre-painted, which makes it a lot easier, but the downside is that the edge that it needs to be glued to is super small. Of course, as this scale is a small car, that isn't of course that strange, but it is still a bit tougher. You need to be really aware of how much glue you're applying and where you're applying it to, of course. I then carefully need to place them and make sure I don't smear all of the glue on top. Luckily, there are 2 of every part for the clear parts in this kit, so if you mess up, you can have a retry, of course. Luckily, I didn't mess up at the first time, so I could just keep moving on, and after gluing it in place, letting the glue sit for a bit, I could remove the protective cover from the outside. And if that wasn't challenging enough, there are even some photo etch window frames that are supplied in the kit as well that need to be glued on too. This again was a really tough part to do, and I took my time doing it. Applying very little glue here and there, just pressing it in place and holding it tight for a bit until it was fully set. After putting the interior in, it was time to move on to fitting the chassis. There was also one big sheet of photo etch, which I wasn't really sure of what it was for, but luckily one of the subscribers kindly commented that it was supposed to be underneath the interior and in between the chassis itself, so I just glued those all in place, could then fit the chassis and add all of the separate parts to it as well. When gluing in the axles, I made a small mistake and glued them in upside down, so the wheels didn't fit the way they were supposed to fit. I cut off the hubs and could then glue the wheels in place, which is pretty much the same way it was meant to be from factory, but I just couldn't use the factory supported parts. The wheels are in place, the discs could then be glued inside of the wheels, and the calipers could be put on as well, and then I could add a bit of paint to detail those out. Once the details were finished on the calipers and the discs themselves, I could place the center of the wheel in too. All of the parts that were previously painted in the chrome finish had now had enough time to cure, so these could be carefully glued in as well. After installing all of the chrome pieces, I could then move on to applying a little bit of microscale crystal clear glue and then start applying all of these small clear parts to go inside. These are of course for the turn signals and some other lights. For now I just left them clear as it was easier when handling them without the paint, so I couldn't damage the paint, and then once they were all fully installed I could carefully paint them in their colors. The headlight lenses in this case are not just simple flat parts, they were actually vacuum formed to make them into the correct bubble shape that these parts are supposed to be in. Now the downside is that they are not pre-cut, and therefore I need to carefully cut them out myself. I'm using some photo etch scissors from Tamiya. These are really sharp, fine scissors and made the job really easy. The glue on some of the clear parts now had a bit of time to set up, and I could move on to carefully painting them. With the final details like the window wipers, some of the emblems on the wheels themselves, and also some paint on the inside of the exhaust tips, this build is finished. And you know what that means, it's time to put it in a nice display box and put it with the rest of the collection. Now, I've heard you guys in the comments saying that you want to see it in an eggshell blue with an orange or brown interior. Well, of course, I would have liked that too, although I already had a model exactly in that color scheme. So instead of copying that one, I decided to add it to my collection of Singer vehicles and paint it in my own unique colorway. I hope you guys enjoyed this series. I know for a fact that I personally did. It was a really nice small build, although the parts weren't really as detailed as normal. There were still a bunch of parts, and as you can see, it turned into a really good looking model. So let me know down in the comments what you thought of this build, and also if you have some ideas for the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.